Welcome to the Secular Hub, a community where atheists, agnostics, humanists, and their families can meet, support each other, have fun, and explore ethics, science, and the human condition. Today, we hear from Matt Hartsock. The title of the talk is Prime Times, Circadian Clocks and the Regulation of Memory. Matt is a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder working in the Spencer Neuroendocrinology Lab.
As part of that lab, Matt seeks to identify molecular mechanisms underlying circadian rhythms and brain function. And his dissertation research examines how daily fluctuations in neuron firing support fear extinction, which is a type of learning relevant to the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. Matt is a recipient of the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, and he's also co-founder of Nerd Nite Boulder, which if you haven't checked out is a pretty awesome thing. And I'll speak a little bit more about Nerd Nite at the very end of this. And then outside of neuroscience, Matt enjoys backpacking and writing music. This is Matt Hartsock.
Thanks so much, Chauncey. I really appreciate the introduction, and thanks to the Secular Hub for inviting me to do this. So my talk is called Prime Times, Circadian Clocks and the Regulation of Memory. So as Chauncey said, the way that the Secular Hub found out about our work was a review article that we published really recently. And so the way that I've decided to structure this talk is to give you some background information that would help you to understand what we were writing about in this article and how it pertains to some of our work more broadly. So circadian rhythms are a term that are becoming a household term. People have heard of this. One of the reasons that they're gaining so much attention in recent years is because we're starting to understand the molecular mechanisms that support circadian rhythms. In fact, in 2017, these three men received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for some of their early work on I quote, the discoveries of molecular mechanisms controlling the circadian rhythm, or as I will say for the rest of this talk, circadian rhythms, plural. And for most people, when they hear the term circadian rhythms, they think of sleep. And that's totally a fair synthesis of some of the literature. Circadian rhythms do control sleep in some ways. In particular, they control the timing of sleep. Circadian rhythms are the reason that most of us sleep at night. They're the reason that college students don't sleep at night quite as often. And they're the reason that people tend to feel sleepiest in the middle of the afternoon. But circadian rhythms are a lot more than just sleep. Generally, the definition for circadian rhythms is biological cycles that last about 24 hours. And so we could say that sleep is one thing that has a circadian rhythm or that follows a circadian rhythm. But in fact, just about every process that's been studied that's going on in the body biologically also follows a circadian rhythm. For instance, you can see in this schematic things like digestion, alertness, muscle strength, cardiovascular efficiency, body temperature. All of these things follow a 24-hour cycle such that they're higher at one point of day and lower at another point of day. And that's where I come into the picture, because in the midst of all of these different circadian rhythms and all of these different tissues and processes throughout the body, I'm really interested in circadian rhythms in memory. For that reason, about 5 years ago, I joined the Spencer Lab. This is the Spencer Neuroendocrinology Lab, as in Bob Spencer, that's Bob. And we study circadian rhythms in a particular kind of memory called extinction memory, which I'll talk about a little bit later toward the end. And when I joined the lab, I was really interested in learning and diving right in and figuring out how circadian rhythms contribute to time of day differences, to different fluctuations in extinction memory. But it turned out that I needed to learn a lot about the circadian system before I could get started. And so I'm going to share what ended up being more or less a 2, maybe 3-year process of figuring out the nitty-gritty of the circadian system with you guys, but I'm going to try to condense that in a way that it doesn't take quite as long. So imagine a cell. This could be any cell. This could be a cell in your brain. This could be a cell in your liver. It could be a cell in your big toe. Whatever the cell is, if you look inside it, you're going to find something called the cellular clock. The cellular clock is a genetic mechanism, like Chauncey was saying in the introduction. We call it a transcriptional translational feedback loop. There are a lot of other things we could call it, but frankly, for the purposes of this talk, calling it just a cellular clock is fine. The cellular clock is important because it keeps time for the cell. And the way that it does that is that the actual physical components of the cellular clock can move around inside the cell nucleus and in the cell cytoplasm and interact with other stuff in the cell, with other physical things in the cell. And by doing that, the cellular clock anchors the functions of the cell in association with the time of day. So it's a temporal anchor for all the things that the cell is doing. There's a cellular clock like this in virtually every cell throughout the body. That's wild. Most people don't, stop and think about what that means, but there's a cellular clock in almost every single cell in your body. So whatever the cellular clock is doing, it's fundamental, not only for individual cells, but maybe for cell function in general. The cellular clock is necessary and it's everywhere. Cellular clocks like this throughout your body are organized in a hierarchy. At the top of that hierarchy is a brain region called the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. That's a mouthful, so we're just going to call it the SCN for short. And so we call the SCN a circadian master clock, or the master clock. And so the SCN contains cellular clocks, just like cells in the rest of the body. But the cellular clocks in the SCN are somewhat unique. And here's why. The SCN receives information from the eye. And so why would that matter? Well, the body learns what time of day it is based on external cues. And one of the main predictors of the time, one of the main things in the environment that tells us what time of day it is, that's the sun. And so the cells in the SCN, the cellular clocks in the SCN, are unique in that they can set their time of day, they can reset their time of day each day in direct response to light, in direct response to sunlight. And so that's not to say that these cells in the SCN aren't keeping good rhythms. In fact, cells in the SCN, cellular clocks in the SCN can maintain rhythms even in constant darkness, which is kind of wild. But what the sun is doing here is it's causing a reset. It's saying, hey, if you got a few minutes forward or a few minutes behind, now is the time that you can start over. This is morning, go. So the SCN then takes that information once its clock has been reset each day, and it relays that information throughout the body. The SCN doesn't have that many connections in the brain, so the question might be, well, how does it do that? And there are a few different ways. It's actually several different ways. One way that the SCN might control other things that are going on in the body is by controlling something like neuronal firing, how fast or how slow different neurons are firing, and relaying that information from the SCN forward throughout the brain. The SCN also controls things like hormone release, such that you get a lot of hormone release at one time of day. The SCN can also control things like body temperature. And through all these different signals, the SCN effectively tells the rest of the body what time of day it is. And it helps all these other cellular clocks to get on board, to get on schedule with the sun. And so something that you're probably noticing from this picture is that all of these other clocks have a different time than the clock of the SCN. And that's totally okay. It turns out that what matters here isn't necessarily just the time that each clock thinks it is, but rather that all the clocks are aligned relative to one another. So for instance, maybe the clock in your left elbow cell thinks that it's 6 p.m. and maybe the clock in your eye thinks that it's 12 p.m. And that's totally okay. What really matters is that those two different cells in different parts of the body stay 6 hours apart no matter what happens. And so what the SCN is doing then is helping to maintain this relationship of time and all of these different clocks throughout the body. And so this system, this hierarchical setup where you have the sun and then the SCN and then everything else, it works really well most of the time, but it makes us vulnerable to a few certain disruptions that we experience normally as human beings, especially in the year 2020. For instance, the system is sensitive to changes in lighting. So if you're looking at light at night after the sun goes down, your brain, your SCN still thinks that it's daytime. If you're particularly sensitive to blue light. That's one of the reasons that you might have heard a lot about that in the news. Blue light is particularly problematic because it mimics the light of the sun. If you change time zones and you see differences in lighting because now you're literally living in a place where the sun is coming up at different times, then that is also going to predispose the system to problems. And so what changes in lighting do ultimately is they confuse the SCN. That confuses the signals that the SCN is sending everywhere else, and that confuses all the other clocks and the other cells throughout your body. So that's one problem with this hierarchy. Another problem is that there are factors besides just the sun that can push around the signals that the SCN is sending throughout the body. For instance, one of the hormones that the SCN uses to communicate with everything else is a stress hormone too. And so if you experience intense stress and that hormone gets released, then clocks throughout your body might think, oh, it's morning, I should reset to this signal now. In which case you end up again with circadian disruption, with different clocks disagreeing about what time of day it is. But generally, a healthy circadian system is highly adaptive. And the reason for that is that the circadian system gives your body the ability to anticipate things that happen every day and get ready for those things in advance. For instance, consider if you were to eat breakfast each morning at 8 a.m., cellular clocks in your body would have to predict that that was going to happen so that they could mobilize you to, they would need to give you the energy to get out of bed and to walk over to the refrigerator. They would need to give you the digestive enzymes that would help you digest that food at that time each day. And so you can see pretty quickly how if we start throwing off the circadian system with disruptions in light or with things like stress, all of a sudden the signals that our body is getting that's helping everything to kind of work as an integrated bodily biological unit, all of that stuff is suddenly out of whack and we start getting health issues. So at the point in my graduate career when I had tackled that information, I thought, great, now I understand the circadian system. I can run forward and start studying circadian influences on memory. And that's when I realized that, in fact, there were a lot of things that I still needed to learn about memory. And so I went through this whole process again to learn what the fundamental things I needed to know about memory are. So I'm going to make the assumption off the bat that most of us have a pretty intuitive sense of what memory is. We learn things, we remember things, that's part of everyday life. But in terms of neuroscience, there are multiple kinds of memories. When someone lists a sentence like this on a slide or in a paper, I want to point out that there's some ambiguity here as to what exactly the different kinds of memory are and like how we should categorize each of them. And there are a lot of ways to do this. So the way that I'm talking about it in this presentation is going to be a way that's very anatomically relevant. So you'll see why that is in just a few slides. But so there are multiple kinds of memories. For instance, there's some memories that have a really strong emotional component. There are some memories that have a really strong reward component. There are some memories that have to do with space and navigating the physical world. How do you remember where a certain building is in a room? And then there are also memories that have to do with, life significance, like getting an email where you got an acceptance or something like that. You have to remember that very abstract association. And it turns out that the brain stores these different kind of memories in different areas or different features of memories. Like if a memory had an emotional component as well as an abstract meaning component, those different features would be stored in different brain areas as well. And so you can see here with these, a few example regions I've said with a few very probably oversimplified example example features or kinds of memories. You can see that areas like the amygdala store emotion, an area like the hippocampus stores spatial information, an area like the striatum stores reward information, an area like the prefrontal cortex stores abstract meaning. And we don't need to know for this talk exactly what those different areas are, but rather that these different features or these different kinds of memories are distributed into different brain regions based on the kind of information that they contain. And so regardless of what kind of memory we're talking about, emotional, reward, meaning, whatever, memory tends to occur in three basic steps. The first is learning. You have to somehow get that information into your brain. The second is maintaining. Once that information is in there, you have to store it until you're going to use that information again. And then finally, you have to, at some point, remember that information. You have to take that information, access it, and use it in a way that is useful for you for whatever goal you're trying to achieve. And we can think about all of those processes, learning, maintaining, and remembering at a behavioral level. You could think about studying for an exam, or you could think about, trying to remember where you placed your car keys. These are very visible things. They change the way that we behave. But these memories are also stored anatomically. You can also think about these memories at a microbiological level. And so memories in that capacity, in that vein, memories are stored at synapses. So synapses are connections between neurons. They're the areas where neurons communicate with one another, where they send and receive information. And so, for instance, in this image, you can see one neuron here and one neuron here. This neuron is sending information across this space to this other neuron. And so basically when experience happens, when life experience happens, you get activity in these synapses. You get the sending and the receiving of information. And ultimately, if that experience is salient, if that experience is memorable, it will cause change. It will cause this connection to get strengthened. And so what do I mean by that? Strengthening of synaptic connections, strengthening of synapses often looks like, the second neuron will increase its size. It could change the way that it's signaling on the inside of the neuron. It would also increase its sensitivity to the signals that are coming from this other neuron. And so that process is a process that we call synaptic plasticity, or just synaptic change. And it turns out that synaptic change is a really complex process. There's a lot going on. This figure that I'm showing here is a figure that you could spend a whole semester just going over some of the things that are shown here. But the point of all of this is that all of these very complex processes that are happening inside neurons, that are happening at synapses, are fundamentally, with experience to support memory, they're increasing the sensitivity of this second neuron to information that it's receiving. And so synaptic plasticity, memory, is ultimately, fundamentally occurring at synapses and is all about how strong the synapse is, how easy it is for this second neuron to respond to the first neuron. And at this point in my graduate career, I was finally like, okay, I have all the information I need. I can start studying circadian influences on memory and circadian influences on synaptic plasticity. But it was at this point that I realized there wasn't quite as much information out there as I thought there was. Or if there was a lot of information, it was very disorganized. And so I needed to coordinate my approach, if you will, to try to figure out how to make sense of the literature that existed. And so the first question I asked is, are there circadian rhythms in memory behavior or memory-related behavior? There are a lot of different ways to study memory-related behavior. There are a lot of different models for this. You can study this in humans using things like word pairs. You tell someone to memorize the word pair river, boat, and then you ask them later to remember the word boat if prompted with the word river. You can study this in other animals too. Zebrafish are a surprising animal that are commonly studied in memory experiments. Drosophila, which is a fruit fly, you'd be also amazed at just how many articles there are showing looking at circadian rhythms and Drosophila memory processes. And then commonly also you'll study rodents. That's what our lab is really interested in. And so this is a typical albino rat, and there are a lot of well-accepted paradigms to study memory behavior in rats.
Hey, Matt, quick question.
Yeah, please.
Do you know why it is that those three are studied in these contexts?
That's a great question. I know that, short answer, no. Long answer, these simpler models have fewer neurons to study. And so it's easier to be able to look at neuron networks and how those networks can be changed by things like memory. We also have a really good understanding of, for instance, the fly circadian system, that a lot of that early work that I was showing that won the Nobel Prize was conducted in flies. And so flies happen to be a great model to extend circadian research to memory research.
All right.
As far as rats go, it's a good intermediate to study mammals instead of, insects or fish or amphibians or what have you, to study humans. So they're a bit more applicable.
All right. Thank you.
And so when looking at this literature, looking at the memory literature on looking at all these different animal models, looking at all the different tasks that each of these animal models is used for, you end up finding that there are a lot of articles, but the literature is very, very scattered. And so I decided to take on the effort of going through every paper that I could find that had in some way studied circadian rhythms on memory behavior and trying to figure out if there were any major takeaways that you could get from all of that work. Ultimately, I found about 70 papers, which equates to about 130 experiments. I went through all of them. I made the worst looking Excel spreadsheet you can possibly imagine. And then ultimately I transformed them into a few graphs or a few charts, which we published. And so these charts, I'm not going to walk through because there's a lot of information in here. But ultimately, each of these charts provides evidence when you organize this literature that at the behavioral level, there are circadian rhythms in memory. And not just that, there are circadian rhythms in all of the processes that support memory, in learning, in maintaining, and in remembering information. And so fundamentally, this question of circadian rhythms in memory, it's relevant. This is a thing that's going to influence the way that we act in the world, that we and other animals act in the world. Circadian rhythms have meaning for the way that we behave. And that led me to my second question. Do cellular clocks have any effect on synaptic function? Are there biological mechanisms that we can look at that help to explain these changes that we see, these circadian rhythms that we see at the behavioral level? And so bringing us back to this, vicious, detailed picture, the point to make here is that this is a model of synaptic plasticity. Like I was saying before, these are different mechanisms involved in the changes that happen with learning, with maintaining, with remembering information. And it turns out that the arms of the cellular clock, these physical components of the cellular clock, interact with virtually all of the mechanisms that control synaptic plasticity. That is to say that they either physically interact with these other molecules or they functionally regulate the activities of these other molecules. And that's really important because ultimately what that tells us is that the cellular clock makes synapses better or worse at supporting memory at different times of day. This is about the capacity of synapses to learn. That's what's fluctuating. This isn't to say that you learn or you don't learn. It's to say how well prepared are you? How well prepared are your synapses to learn at different times of day? And you might wonder then, why is that a good thing? Why would we want there to be a time of day when we're bad at learning something or bad at remembering something? And that brings me to what I think is the most interesting finding from all of this literature reading, which is that our brains are better at certain kinds of memory at certain times of day. And so I want to provide an example for this. For instance, our lab is really interested in fear memory. and also fear extinction, which I'll talk about in just a second. But so fear memory, you could think of this as being something that you form, a memory that you form when danger is present. So something bad happens. There's you're living in a cave millions of years ago, and a predator comes to your cave and tries to eat you in the middle of the night. That's a time when you are really vulnerable. You're usually sleeping, you might be alone, and you really want to remember that, because the next time that you're in a similar situation, you want to be able to be prepared for that kind of danger, be prepared, be ready to deal with a threat like that. And so with this kind of memory, we can see that a fear memory seems to be stronger, seems to be better formed, maintained, and recalled at night, and maybe less so during the day. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have this other thing called fear extinction memory. So fear extinction is basically the opposite process to fear learning. So fear extinction is a process by which you learn to inhibit those learned fear responses. And so with fear extinction, you see an exactly opposite pattern here, where you're learning, you're maintaining, you're remembering those fear extinction memories a lot better during the day compared to at night. And I think there's probably some functional relevance to this difference. Like I was saying, it seems adaptive. It seems like a survival advantage to be able to be particularly attuned to danger that happens when you're most vulnerable. But fear extinction, it would be better for that to be more effective during the day, at a time when, as humans, we need to be out looking for food, out exploring, out socializing, out reproducing. And so it makes sense then that there's this difference, that there's this circadian rhythm in each of these kinds of memory, and that circadian rhythm is opposite in one kind of memory versus another. And when we think back then to the fact that different clocks in different areas of our brains are on different schedules, it makes a lot of sense in this context. If all of your clocks were on the same schedule throughout the brain, you wouldn't be able to have these different temporal niches for different kinds of learning and remembering. But because those clocks are ticking away at slightly different times, at times that are adaptive and different from one another, that allows us to learn and remember information in a way that is useful for survival. And so it's for this reason that I've called this talk Prime Times, because in other words, your brain is better at remembering certain kinds of information at times of day when that information will be most useful. Your brain is primed for that kind of learning or that kind of remembering. And so I'd like to tell you that we have all the information we need to explain, what kind of learning you should be doing at what time of day, and what kind of other learning you should be doing at what other time of day. But frankly, the research field is not there yet. We're really interested in these circadian rhythms and fear and extinction because there's a lot of research there. And so we're working forward with this model that's really well understood. But in terms of other kinds of memories, spatial memories, addiction memories, there's just not as much literature out there. And the literature that is out there somewhat conflicts. And so really, we just need time to answer these questions. And I think that at some point in the future, we'll be able to point to different kinds of memory and say, this is when you should do this thing, or this is when you should avoid this other thing, which is a really exciting research direction. And so even though I can't be prescriptive in that way to tell you what kinds of memory you should work on at what times of day, it doesn't change the fact that from all of this research comes the insight that optimizing memory requires circadian health. And so then what are ways that we can optimize the health of our circadian system? Well, we can do things like reduce blue light at night. This is a filter that you can get for free on the internet that helps to reduce blue light coming out of your computer screen at night. You can also use things like night shift. You can buy glasses that filter out blue light. There are all kinds of ways to reduce this harmful blue light that's throwing off your circadian system at night. We can exercise. It seems like exercise helps to lock in the circadian rhythm, the different molecules that the SCN is releasing to the rest of the brain and body. We can also try to keep consistent schedules with when we eat. Food is another thing that seems to lock in the time of cellular clocks throughout the body. And so by doing these things like exercise and eating, we're helping to keep everything kind of in order and on schedule, help all of these integrated signals to integrate properly. And also in that vein, sleeping. Sleep is obviously important for a whole slew of health-related concerns. But in this context, sleep, the timing of sleep is helping to organize the timing of other things in your body. You know, if you're sleeping at night, that means that you're awake during the day. That means that you're exercising during the day, eating during the day, socializing during the day. But if you flip your schedule, it's not just sleep that changes, it's all of that other stuff too. And so by trying to maintain a consistent sleep schedule, by sleeping, you know, at night at regular times, that helps you to keep your circadian system as healthy and regular as possible. And then finally, and something that I think is one of the most important things here, is trying to get enough light. Especially now in the time of COVID, it's really hard to be in the sun a lot. But the sun is what helps to reset the circadian system each day. And there's an increasing amount of research suggesting that sunlight in the afternoon is also important, and that to see some dimming of the sun, you know, like a sunset, is important in the evening. And so it's really important that we try to reduce our reliance on things like indoor lighting, as I sit here in fluorescent lights, and increase our reliance on things like sunlight. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all. I'd like to thank the Spencer Lab. They gave me a lot of support, feedback on the writing as I was working through this learning and submitting process. I'd like to thank Chauncey and the rest of the Secular Hub team for inviting me to give this talk. I really enjoy doing talks like this, and so thank you for reaching out. You also made the process really easy and straightforward, so I really appreciate the ability to work with a team like that. And then finally, I'd like to thank you guys all for being here and for being the ears of my presentation. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it. All right, so you all have the ability to unmute yourselves. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute and ask away.
Hi, I'm out for my walk, getting my exercise in sunlight right now, so sorry if it's loud.
No worries. Go for it.
But to that effect, you know, would it be better for my circadian rhythm, because I like to take a walk every day, to do it then at the same time every day?
Yes, but also balance that with the fact that, you know, exercise is good for you. And so if there's only one time of day, you know, if the time of day at which you have the opportunity to go on a walk is a little bit different every day, it's probably better to exercise each day than it is to not exercise unless you can exercise in that specific time slot.
Right. Well, and I'm trying to do that, you know, right when I finish work at 4:30, just like, you know, boom, getting my shoes on and go for a walk, right? And what about, I don't know if you have enough data yet, but what about, like, I like to listen to audio books while I'm walking. Do you have, or have you heard of any research that has either said that it's better to do that while exercising or better to do that while not exercising?
Ooh, I have no idea. I'm sorry, but that's an awesome question. I don't know.
All right, well, thank you. I'm going to keep walking and keep listening. This is fantastic.
Thank you.
There's a significant difference in the time of daylight from near the winter solstice and the summer solstice. Mm-hmm. Is there any way in which the resetting of the circadian clock somehow can deal with that?
Yeah. So that's a huge question. And so it seems that melatonin is particularly important for helping to know how the seasons change. So I talked about circadian rhythms in this talk. What you're asking about specifically is circannual rhythms, rhythms that are about a year long, as opposed to about a day, about a year. And so seasonal changes are circannual rhythms. So the hormone melatonin is a hormone that is fondly by some researchers called the darkness hormone, because it's only released when it's dark out. So melatonin release is controlled in part by your circadian system. Your circadian system tells melatonin to get released at a particular time each day. But if you keep the lights on at night, that prevents melatonin from being released then. And so basically, as soon as you turn the lights off, the go signal for melatonin is already there, and your body starts releasing melatonin. In natural conditions where there's no artificial lighting, the duration of melatonin release will vary depending on the season. It will vary with the length of the night. And so to come back to your question a bit, it seems like the circadian system and circannual system, if you will, are working together in some kind of complex, interesting way. So yes, but I can't tell you a whole lot beyond that. It's just slightly outside of my research focus. So I know a little bit, but can't go in more detail. But it's a fantastic question.
Thank you.
What do you think about daylight savings time and moving your active times back and forth?
It's a terrible idea. That's scientifically accepted. Each year at daylight savings time, heart attacks increase, strokes increase, car accidents increase. Basically, if there's a bad thing and it's been studied, it goes up at daylight savings time. And that's true whether you're turning the clocks forward or turning the clocks back, which tells us that that daylight savings time is hurting our health, not just because we're reducing the amount of sleep we're getting, but because we're changing our circadian schedules. And so I know that there are different circadian foundations that have made public announcements that they think that we should get rid of, that they think that there is enough evidence available to justify getting rid of daylight savings time for that reason.
I got one question through chat. The question, it leads off with, I have wide junctures in my endothelial cells, which affects my blood-brain barrier. This makes me extremely foggy-minded, even with one person walking by wearing perfume or someone who has smoke on their clothes. And the person says that this affects their memory and cognitive processing, etc. Is there a way to leverage circadian rhythms to strengthen their cells?
That's a great question. I don't know too much about that particular condition, but I would say, you know, just those sort of accepted tips for benefiting your health. Going to bed at a consistent time every day, trying to regularize the time that you eat and exercise, reducing blue light at night, and trying to get as much sunlight as possible. It seems that those things help to make you resilient against those other changes that it sounds like you might be experiencing.
In terms of being outside and exposing yourself to light, do sunglasses impair that process significantly?
That's a good question. I don't actually know too much about the research on that, but if I had to guess, I would say probably not to a terrible extent. I realize that the reason I'm saying that is because when you're wearing sunglasses, light still can get to your eyes around the sides of the sunglasses, but you are still reducing the brightness of the light. And so I would say it probably has some effect, but I'm not sure to what extent.
Thank you.
It might depend on the sunglasses too, because certain sunglasses are designed to filter certain wavelengths of light.
Matt, any research on memory ability differences between early birds and night owls?
That's an awesome question. I don't know of memory studies specifically, but I do know some other things that might be applicable, and I would maybe, you know, against my better instincts, extrapolate a little bit. So early birds and night owls, those are called chronotypes. There are such things as midday wonders too. I don't know who those people are, but we all envy you. But so the thinking surrounding different chronotypes is that ultimately that's a thing that's produced by exposure to light. So late chronotypes are a thing that happen in response to light. For instance, there was a study that was done here a few years ago. This was actually one of the articles that I showed on that first slide, one of the things from the internet. So this study was done by someone named Ellen Strathard, who works in Ken Wright's research lab here at CU Boulder. That's the big sleep circadian research lab on campus. And what they did was, in typical Boulder fashion, they took a lot of people out camping for a few days. The only rules were no flashlights, no cell phones, no computers, basically just nothing that causes exposure to artificial light, no artificial lighting. And so when they took those people out into the woods, they found that they had a bunch of different chronotypes. They had some morning birds, some midday wonders, and some night owls. But after just 2 to 3 days out in nature without any artificial lighting, everyone was an early bird. Everyone was a morning person. And so that suggests that it's this artificial lighting that's actually mucking with our circadian system, that's actually pushing people around. And so there's some other data out there then, building off of that idea, that shows, this has also been done by Ken Wright's lab, the study I'm about to talk about, showing that different different abilities related to athleticism, things like muscle tone, VO max, oxygen usage, all these different things are different between morning birds, midday wonders, and night owls. And the difference is such that there's the most variability. There's a huge amount of variability in night owls specifically. And so again, the thinking is that lighting is somehow changing the way that night owls function. And it looks like, based on sort of research in general, that night owls tend to be the group that has the most health disruption. So yeah, that's what I can say about that. And so I would imagine that night owls would probably do worse on memory tasks compared to morning birds. But again, I don't think there have been any studies on that, so I can't say that definitively. And you'd have to have a very large number of people to make a study like that possible, because it might be a small difference.
All right, we've got another question from the chat. Does scheduled meditation support circadian rhythms? What does research reveal about the connection between atrial fibrillation of the heart and the circadian system rhythm?
Those are both great questions. I don't know anything about scheduled meditations and how that influences or helps the circadian system. As for atrial fibrillation, like I said, what I know is that with circadian disruption, like what happens at daylight savings time, heart attacks increase. And so clearly there's some mechanism by which the circadian system is regulating the heart. I also know that things like blood pressure, let's see, what other measures can I think of off the top of my head for the cardiovascular system? Things like blood pressure and heart rate do follow a circadian rhythm and change across the day. And so because of that, I don't know the exact research, but I would assume that there is research out there showing that circadian disruptions are pushing around those different variables in ways that are disruptive for health.
Another question from the chat. Let's see, to piggyback on Jen's question, if there's an advantage to seeing the sun set, is it better to exercise at the same time each day or to exercise at the same time relative to the sun, for example, at sunset each day?
That's a really good question, and one that I don't know the answer to off the top of my head. I would assume that things, so exposure to sunlight in the morning ultimately is what resets the circadian clock in the SCN, right? So I would assume that your daily timing, like the day it would be best to exercise, would be in relation to your first sunlight exposure in the morning rather than your last sunlight exposure at night. But again, I don't know if anyone has addressed that question specifically. It's a fantastic question.
So thanks for a great talk. I also am out walking. Not sure you can see me. I know it's really bright out here. So, you know, there's different memory systems, as you said, muscle memory, the ability to learn new skill, declarative memory, the ability to learn information and recall it. Do those memory systems tend to operate at the same efficiency level throughout the circadian rhythm? Or are there times when it's better to learn a new skill and times when it's better to learn information you need to memorize and recall?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And honestly, those are the kinds of questions that I would be really interested in answering. But I think the data is just not conclusive yet.
All right, another question from the chat. Are people who work second or night shift at a greater disadvantage from learning or committing things to memory?
Again, there haven't been studies on this, but the thinking based on the things that I was presenting today suggests that yes, they are.
All right, and then another one we've heard a lot about teenagers and their need to get a lot of sleep, where forcing them to be early risers is often counterproductive. Starting high school class at 7:30 or 8 o'clock. Does your research address this?
We have not. So again, we work with rats, not high school students. So very, very different populations with very different needs. I know that there are some groups of people who are working with this. I saw a presentation this past summer that was working with, I believe, high school students. And they were showing that grades improved when start times were later for high school students.
Okay, so I'm probably going to have trouble with some of the language in this one. Let's see, have any studies been conducted on the effects of adenophil and other nootropics on circadian rhythms?
I don't know. That's a little bit outside of what I was doing my crash course on for this paper. I know that I came across some papers that were looking at drugs, and I know that there are definitely differences in pharmacological action at different time of day, but I can't speak to the specifics.
Okay. Another one, in trauma PTSD, is it possible to re-regulate the clocks if the stress response cortisol is still out of whack?
That's much more in my wheelhouse, and is something that we're trying to figure out. It's possible, for instance, that cortisol disruption is not a cause but a consequence of PTSD. We don't know that for sure, so don't hold me to that. But it's possible that by addressing the circadian system, we might be able to fix things like cortisol dysregulation. The stress hormone that I was making reference to throughout this talk is cortisol, or corticosterone in rats. That is a circadian hormone. And so it's possible also from another perspective that cortisol dysregulation is the cause of PTSD. By changing the circadian rhythm of cortisol, you might be changing circadian timing in the body and changing the ability of people with PTSD to learn extinction memories, ultimately. But yeah, a great question, and I think one that many people are interested in addressing as soon as possible.
Did you come across any interesting research on extreme conditions that would affect the SCN, such as serving on a submarine or the International Space Station?
Yeah, I know of one study. They were looking at astronauts who, I believe, I forget what their day length was, but it wasn't exactly 24 hours. And I know that it disrupted memory. I can't remember specifically what kind of memory. I think it was recall for word pairs, the example that I showed you, but I'd have to look that up.
Okay. And then can you speak to how circadian rhythms are related to and affect the menstrual cycle? I'm assuming circadian rhythms affect more than just stress hormones.
Yeah, I can't speak to it, but I am guessing that there are effects there. I know that there's an interesting, although highly contested paper that came out a few years ago that was looking at, there are also circalunar rhythms, which is just a whole other world of research showing that sleep changed with moon cycles. And so the menstrual cycle, based on its length, could potentially be some kind of circalunar rhythm. But again, the The issue with these things is that this is really complicated. You know, circadian rhythms, circannual rhythms, circalunar rhythms, all of these things are probably being integrated some way in regulating any given process. And unfortunately, I just don't have the expertise in sex hormones to be able to comment any more on that.
Hi, Matt. It's really good to hear about your work and what you've been up to. I have a question about blind folks. Do they have circadian rhythms in the same way? Like, do they still have cells in their eyes that are detecting light even if they can't see?
That's a great question. And the answer is it depends. There are some versions of blindness where you lose the cells in your eyes that are sending brightness information to your SCN. And there are other forms where you don't lose those cells. And so in people who don't have those brightness detectors anymore, you definitely see circadian disruption. There are a fair number of studies on that.
Thanks, that's awesome.
Thank you for coming. Great to see you.
Daylight time question again. When daylight time came to me, when I was first aware of it, there were people who said, little old lady who said, my African violets have enough daylight as it is. Don't give me more hours. The point I'm saying is, all we're doing is a clock. Are you sure that those effects of heart attacks are more just concerned with the sun coming up earlier versus daylight time?
Yeah, I mean, the heart attacks and things that happen at daylight savings time appear to happen like just within a few days, right after the schedule changes.
Oh.
And so at least in that example, we think that it is related directly to the time change. But there are other conditions that might be related to day length. For instance, there's something called seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, where people feel sad in the winter. And that seems to be related probably to the length of the days.
Because I love daylight saved, because I'm a morning person. I'm going to wake up when the sun is bright and shiny. It might as well be the part of the day I'm going to be living in.
Yeah, I hear that.
So there's another question here, and let me maybe see if I was listening well enough to help with the answer. So what kinds of learning should we do at what times? For instance, physical skills, reasoning skills, reading, listening, making music. And if I remember right, what you were saying is that when it comes to studying those specific sorts of things in humans, there's still some work to do. But one thing that we can do is make our circadian clocks as regular as possible by kind of maintaining regular schedules. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is there more to add?
No, that's it. I mean, basically the clinical suggestion doesn't change much, even though there's a lot that we still want to know.
Okay. All right. Any other questions online?
Thank you all. These are wonderful questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt. This was a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. And I'm sure that everybody else did too, based on the volume of questions that you received. So thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
We here at the Secular Hub are happy you could join us and hope you enjoyed listening to today's talk. To learn more about the Secular Hub and our upcoming events, to become a member, or to show your support, find us on the web at secularhub.org. Before we wrap, I'd like to give a special shout out and thank you to our speaker and also to the volunteers who put in the time and effort to bring this event to life. We see you, and we couldn't do this without you.